Right, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at density dependent and independent, density dependent and density independent factors that lead to limits to population growth. Let's go ahead and start with our density dependent factors. These are things like disease, and believe it or not, disease actually spreads much more rapidly in densely populated areas. And so if you have a very, very densely populated area, disease is going to take you out. It's going to hurt you a lot more than if everybody is spread out. The reason for that should be somewhat intuitive, and it's just that if you don't live right next to other people, it's a lot harder for the disease itself to get from them to you. If you live, way out in the country where your nearest neighbor is a half a mile away, it's a lot harder for you to get a virus or a bacteria or parasite or any other kind of disease than if you were right next door, if your neighbor lives, 20 feet away from you. The other density dependent factor is things like competition. As you can see here, there's a bunch of different animals competing for a limited water supply. The other things that animals could be competing for that might limit their populations would be things like food. If there's not enough grass, these zebra aren't going to survive. It could be things like shelter, which doesn't really apply to zebra, but let's talk about us, for instance. If you're out with a group of people living in a cave for whatever reason, and it's snowing outside and there's not enough room in the cave, there's going to be competition for that shelter, and somebody might not survive. So again, if you have too many people and not enough cave, your population is going to decrease. If we're talking about things like plants, access to light might matter. So in this case, this would be kind of like the same thing as space. Okay, if there's not enough room in an area, plants can't get enough light. Plants may die. Also, as is pictured here, water is a very important resource. If there is a limited amount, only so many organisms can survive in a particular area, which again drives the carrying capacity as discussed in the last lecture. The next density dependent factor that we can talk about is predation. If there is a whole bunch of animals in the same area, as with these zebra, they are more likely to be hunted as opposed to just being very, very far flung and off by yourself. So the number of prey items in an area is going to be another density dependent factor that's going to lead your population to be limited in size. So disease, competition, predation. These are often biotic things. So your density dependent factors are more often biotic. So disease, viruses aren't really alive, but disease could be, things like bacteria or parasites, which are alive. And again, how close you are to your neighbor. And that's what we mean by density, by the way. I guess I should have defined that at the beginning. But density is the number of organisms in a particular area. When we're talking about density, we're talking about population density, which is the number of organisms in a particular area. So yeah, disease, competition, predation, all three of these things depend on how many of you, or how many zebras, or how many lions, or whatever organism we're talking about. These things are all limits to your population size that depend on the number of organisms, the density of organisms in a particular area. So moving on, we're going to talk about the density independent factors. The things that it doesn't make a difference how large your population is. This is still going to lead you to a particular carrying capacity. This is still going to cause you to not be able to grow exponentially. The first thing here is severe storms and flooding. Again, storms and flooding don't really care how many of you there are, right? It doesn't make a difference if there are 10 of you or if there are 10,000 of you. Storms and flooding are still going to have an impact on your overall population size. We also have extreme hot and cold spells like we see very frequently in the modern age, thanks to global climate change. These things also do not care how many of you there are. And then my favorite idea of a density-independent factor is the catastrophic meteorite that took out the dinosaurs. Okay, it didn't matter how many of them there were. It was completely independent of their density, if you will. They still were wiped out. And, you know, there are other things that took out the dinosaurs as well, but this is just a fun example. We also have things like earthquakes. Anyway, these are typically of the natural disaster variety, and these are most often these density independent factors, these limits to your population size that are independent of the number of organisms in a particular area, are often non-biotic. These are often things that are non-living that cause this limit to population size to take place.